I can understand. Hi, Bill.
Yeah, the problem. Well, somebody is
I try to. I don't do social media. Some do it, but I took a little bit. Oh my God, very cool. This is I'm trying to think. So, he does evidence that experience gathering supplies.
Hi, for those of you who are joining online, the program will be starting shortly. If you locate the QA button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that will enable you to participate in the question and answer program following the remarks. Again, the presentation will be starting shortly. Thanks for joining us. Same for you all.
Test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Wow.
The wife's son. He's written a couple of things named related to Hinghams. But that was there were a number of very old
And the one going down.
For those of you who are joining online, the program will begin shortly. Please note that the speaker box will remain a small visual in your upper right-hand corner, given our technical needs to make sure you see the Zoom presentation. So I'm sorry we won't make that full screen, but we want to make sure you see JL Bell's amazing visuals. So again, the program will start shortly. Locate the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen so you can participate in the question and answer portion. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our third lecture with JL Bell. We're very excited to have all of you on this very lovely late November day. So just as a brief introduction, I'm Victoria McCallion. I am the Hingham Historical Society's museum educator. And so I figured I would just give a brief update on the education front. So this past month, we've hosted quite a lot of Hingham's public school fifth grade class at the Old Ordinary Old Ship Church, and we've been walking them through the historic district. And next week marks our very last of our fifth grade field trips for the fall, and that's with Plymouth River School. So we've got 70 more to go on Wednesday and Friday, but we're very excited. It's a great program, and we love doing it. And just as a couple of updates on some upcoming programs and notes. So running through this month and through December, we'll be having our regular tour schedule of the Old Ordinary, the Benjamin Lincoln House, tours of this building, walking tours, and cart tours, all the way up until December 21st. So if you have any family or friends in for the holidays, you know, there's nothing like a happy holidays like bringing them on a historic tour. And then also just a reminder that on December 8th, Sunday, 3 o'clock, same time, same place, we'll be having our fourth lecture. So we hope to see you there. And so now I will be introducing to you our new Director of Programs and Operations, Hillary Goodnow.
Thank you, Victoria. All right. So my name is Hillary Goodnow, and I'm so delighted to be here to introduce our speaker for today. We are so privileged to have Mr. J.L. Bell here to speak with us about the Spies in Henry Barnes's house. Mr. Bell is a Massachusetts writer, and he specializes in the start of the American Revolution around Boston, and particularly children's experiences between 1765 and 1775. He's published extensively in scholarly publications and popular articles for both adults and children. He's been featured on C-SPAN and the Benjamin Franklin's World podcast, as well as being a consultant for an episode of History Detectives and an exhibit contributor for the Minuteman National Historical Park. Since 2006, his popular blog, Boston 1775, has introduced thousands of readers to, quote, a miscellany of information about New England before, during, and after the American Revolution, and about how that history has been studied, taught, preserved, politicized, mythologized, lost, recovered, discussed, described, distorted, and digitized. And so today, Mr. Bell is going to share with us his latest research on espionage in the American Revolution, particularly here in Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming Mr. J.L. Bell.
Thank you. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you to Deirdre and Victoria and everybody here at the Hingham Historical Society for having me. So far in this lecture series, you've heard from Mary Beth Norton talking about the year 1774 and how all the events of that year drove 12 and then 13 colonies to resisting the government in London. And you've heard from Robert Parkinson talk about what drove public opinion in America from resistance towards independence over the year 1776. Those are big picture subjects. I look at little pictures. I'm going to talk about a much smaller picture. I'm going to focus on one night. In fact, about less than an hour on that night, when in March 1775, when spies came to Henry Barnes's house in Marlborough, Massachusetts. Now, you may wonder why I've come to Hingham to talk about Marlborough, which is 50 miles away. But there are some local connections. To start with, the Hingham Historical Society owns this portrait of Henry Barnes, and those of you in the room can see it right here, and you'll have a chance to look at it more closely when I'm done. Henry was born in late 1723, which made him about 51 years old on the night in question. His father had come to Boston from England as a merchant around 1710. The father was a staunch member of the Church of England. Most British people in New England were Congregationalists, descendants of the Puritan settlers, and they were still somewhat suspicious of the church, the Anglicans. Wealthy Anglicans like Henry Barnes, therefore, tended to cluster with other wealthy Anglicans, and indeed Henry married the daughter of his father's business partner in 1746. The Hingham Historical Society also owns this portrait of Christian Barnes, and it is here with us today. This lady, born Christian Arbuthnot, was almost the same age as Henry. They had a child, a baby also named Christian, who lived a very short time in 1751. 2 years later, as Henry and Christian Barnes were approaching the age of 30, they moved out of Boston, the trading hub of the province, and they settled in the town of Marlborough. Henry set up several business ventures, starting with a distillery to turn apple cider into brandy. He built a workshop for turning wood into potash and then potash into pearl ash. He opened a country store selling goods made or imported into Boston. The royal governor appointed him to be a justice of the peace. So he was a big man in Marlborough. He was a gentleman. He was Henry Barnes, Esquire. I said before that Henry and Christian had a baby who died in 1751. Lots of couples lost babies at that time. But Henry and Christian never had any more that we know about. That probably indicates some medical condition that prevented them from becoming biological parents. But they took in young relatives, particularly nieces and nieces of friends. And Christian sort of raised them, taught them how to be ladies. In 1775, Christian and Henry were looking after a little girl about 10 years old named Chrissy Arbuthnot. She was the daughter of Christian Barnes's brother, William, who had died a few years before. And Chrissy had been born in Hingham. So there's another local connection. This is a picture of the Barnes house as it existed in the late 1800s. By that time, it had been considerably expanded. But even in 1775, in its original form, it was one of the biggest houses in Marlborough. Henry Barnes in 1771 was taxed for a house, 2 work buildings, a still house, a distillery, 1,600 pounds worth of merchandise in his stores, 2 slaves, real estate worth 15 pounds in annual rent, 1 horse, 1 cow, and 8 acres of land. He was one of the biggest taxpayers in the area. Of those 2 enslaved people, one was a middle-aged woman named Daphne. The other may have been Daphne's son named Prince, and I'll come back to him. Henry Barnes stood out from his neighbors because of his wealth, his religion, and his lack of local family ties. But he seems to have gotten along all right with his neighbors in Marlborough until late 1769. The trouble started with Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer of the British government in 1767. He designed a set of tariffs on certain goods imported into the North American colonies from Britain, goods that people really couldn't buy easily or in quantity from local manufacturers like glass, paper, painters' colors, goods that were also available only because of the British Empire like tea. For Townshend, these tariffs were a way for the colonies to contribute to governing the empire now that they were more prosperous in North America and now that they were no longer threatened by New France. However, to many colonists, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, these tariffs were a form of taxation without representation. Taxes levied by Parliament on communities not represented in Parliament. Americans believed they had beaten back an earlier attempt at such taxation, the Stamp Act in 1765. And their countermeasures, the way the tactics that had worked, they believed, were boycotting goods from Britain so that the merchants in London and other trading ports would see their business suffer, and they would use their influence on Parliament to make Parliament repeal the tax, and to back that up, a little light rioting. So in the late 1760s, American activists tried the same tactics again. They promoted another boycott. The word boycott hadn't yet been coined, so they called this non-importation. And in Boston, most merchants signed a pledge not to import any more goods from Britain except for small things that we really, really need. And in late 1769, crowds started to put pressure on the few merchants who didn't sign that agreement. Those political tensions in Boston were exacerbated by the fact that the royal government had stationed 2 regiments of troops in the town to protect the customs officers who were collecting those taxes. So there were hundreds of soldiers in the crowded town as well. In early 1770, the Boston Gazette, which was the province's largest and most radical newspaper, started to run a front-page list on every issue of the people who had still not signed that agreement and were still importing goods. And at the bottom of that list of importers was Henry Barnes, trader in the town of Marlborough. In February and March 1770, the tensions in Boston turned fatal. First, a customs officer shot into a crowd attacking his house, killing a young boy. Then fights between civilians and soldiers spiraled into a riot in the center of town. Soldiers killed 5 men and boys and wounded several more. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Under pressure from the acting governor, the acting governor, Thomas Hutchinson, agreed to move the army regiments left in town out into an island in Boston Harbor, Castle Island, as it's now called, even though it's no longer an island than it was. Most of the customs officers also went there because they didn't feel safe in town anymore without the soldiers, which meant that really it was free reign in Boston at that point. On March 29th, so less than 3 weeks after the Boston Massacre, the men of Marlborough gathered in a town meeting and passed several resolutions, including one that said, "We are astonished to find that a number are at this critical time so sordidly detached from the public interest and are so selfish and impudent as to stand out and not comply with the non-importation agreement." That meant Henry Barnes. His wife Christian wrote to a friend, "These poor deluded people with whom we have lived so long in peace and harmony have been influenced by the sons of rapine to take every method to distress us." The town chose inspectors to watch who bought goods at Henry Barnes's store when they were supposed to be boycotting him. The committee of inspection included a man named Alpheus Woods. The activists in Marlborough also started to express their displeasure with Henry Barnes in a traditional British way of opposing a rich man, which is damaging his property. Christian wrote, "The first thing that fell a sacrifice to their malice and revenge was the coach. They took the cushions out and put them in the brook, and the next night cut the carriage to pieces. Not long after, they broke the windows at the pearl ash works. Locals also attacked a wagon of goods headed to the Barnes store from Boston, and they cut a bag of pepper, letting it all into the street, then gathered it up in their hands and hats and carried it off." On June 11th, an effigy was hung upon a hill in sight of the house, with a paper pinned to the breast whereon was wrote, "Henry Barnes, the infamous importer." And the Boston Gazette later reported, "An old hay bag stuffed with hay or straw formed with a man's crotch, body, neck, and head, and hanged by the neck to a gallows with a paper fastened to his breast with the words written in capital letters, 'A notorious importer Henry, Tory, booby.' In the evening it was cut down and burned with loud huzzas." And a few days after that, people made another effigy, stuck it on a stolen horse with pine tar, and set him loose about the town. And on this effigy was another infamous paper, Christian Barnes wrote, "Wishing all of us in hell." And then somebody sent Henry Barnes an incendiary letter, threatening to fire his shop and destroy all his substance that he hath on the earth, and to take his body and tar it, and if nothing else will do but death, he shall certainly have it, if he did not shut up his shop and forbear selling and importing of goods. The Barneses suspected that that letter had come from Alpheus Woods, member of the inspection committee. Acting Governor Hutchinson and his council in Boston issued a reward for whoever sent this anonymous letter. But the selectmen of Marlborough went to Henry Barnes and said they suspected it was hatched by Barnes's own party. They suspected it was all a fake. Christian Barnes blamed a lot of the trouble on two young men, the Speakman brothers. One of those brothers, Gilbert, appeared to be setting up a rival shop in Marlborough. And what made that situation worse for her was that the Speakmans had actually been part of their social circle of upper-class Anglicans. And now young Gibbs Speakman was both setting up his rival business and also perhaps stirring up trouble against Henry to benefit that business. But in a few months, it all calmed down. By the end of 1770, it was fine. In the spring of 1770, Parliament had repealed most of the Townshend duties, leaving only the tax on tea, although that was the tax that brought in the most money. Gilbert Speakman had decided to set up a tannery business instead of a competing pearl ash manufactory, and Henry Barnes got out of town for a while. And here we come back to Prince, the young man enslaved by the Barneses. He had shown himself to be a talented artist. The Barneses were excited at the prospect of improving his genius in painting. Christian wondered in a letter if he might be trained by the local artist she called Mr. Copling, John Singleton Copley. On October 11th, the Boston Newsletter reported Henry Barnes sailed for London, and he took Prince with him and found the young man an art tutor named Mr. Pine. This is probably Robert Edge Pine, an established portrait painter in the imperial capital. These are Pine's portraits of the actor David Garrick and the historian Catherine Macaulay, who were both big celebrities in Britain. Henry Barnes came back to Marlborough in the summer of 1771, and then we see Prince, now using the name Prince Demah or Prince Demah Barnes, also returned, and he appears to have advertised his services in the Boston papers. Prince Demah Barnes painted those portraits of Henry and Christian Barnes, and this is the third painting known to be by him, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and was identified and studied through the work of Paula Bagger of the Hingham Historical Society. Prince Demah became a free and independent craftsman in Boston, though his mother, Daphne, remained enslaved out in Marlborough. Now, when Henry Barnes returned to Massachusetts in 1771, the political climate was much calmer than when he left. And it stayed pretty calm until late 1773, when that tax on tea became a big issue because of a new law that redefined how tea could be imported into the colonies. That led to the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor in 1773, December 1773, what later generations dubbed the Boston Tea Party. And that really ticked off the government in London because the tea was expensive and it was the property of a very well-connected business venture that was too big to fail. That convinced Parliament that Boston needed more discipline. The government sent General Thomas Gage to Boston in May 1774 as the new governor. He was already commander-in-chief of all the British troops in North America, and he brought troops back into central Boston. Gage and the Royal Navy started to enforce a new law from Parliament, the Boston Port Bill. That law meant no ship could come from Britain or another colony and unload in Boston, nor sail from Boston to another colony until the town repaid the cost of the tea. And then in August 1774, the Massachusetts Government Act arrived. This law made permanent unilateral changes in the provincial constitution. And there was an immediate response from the people of Massachusetts: county conventions, court closings, starting in the western part of the province, moving east. In August, Gage swore in a new council, men selected in London rather than elected locally, the way they count to be chosen. Neighbors pressured those men to refuse to join the council, to resign from it. Or if they didn't want to do either of those, they could just leave for Boston, never come back to town again. In places like Taunton, that pressure, that local pressure, included violence or threats. Now, Henry Barnes wasn't one of those counselors. He's not on this list, but he knew what rural crowds could do, and he had friends on this list. Then on September 1st, General Gage had his soldiers seize gunpowder from this storehouse in what is now Somerville. The Redcoats also took away 2 cannon used by a militia company in Cambridge. On September 2nd, the people of Middlesex County responded. 5,000 men in their militia companies marched into Cambridge. Among those companies were 2 from Marlborough, including a horse troop probably led by young Gilbert Speakman. The massive crowd forced every royal official in Cambridge to resign or apologize, all the way up to the new lieutenant governor. And on September 3rd, it was clear there was a new balance of power in Massachusetts. General Gage's authority as royal governor, his ability to tell people what to do, stopped at the gates of Boston. The rest of the colony was, in all practical purposes, independent of royal control. And in addition, the long conflict that had been political so far, it was turning military. General Gage fortified the town. He sent for more troops from New York and from Quebec. And another consequence of this shift is what I call an arms race, a race to grab all the cannon and mortars and other artillery equipment that people could find in and around Boston. For example, the people of Charlestown emptied the cannon out of their shore battery. The Royal Navy went into Boston's North Battery and spiked all the guns. Gage posted sentries outside the Boston Militia Artillery Company's 2 armories, and those gun houses, as they were called, they held 4 small brass guns. And on 2 separate nights in the middle of September 1774, members of the militia company broke into their own armories and spirited away all 4 of their cannon. Gage tried to warn officials in London about what he was seeing in Massachusetts. He reported that most of New England was in rebellion. He urged the government to send more soldiers and spend more money, and he got only minimal support. Meanwhile, the Massachusetts Patriots moved to fill the vacuum of power outside of Boston. And in October, they formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, a forbidden legislature. One of the main centers of resistance to the crown at this time in the countryside was Worcester. And the town's rising political leader was a man named Timothy Bigelow. He was not a gentleman, farmer, or an attorney, or a merchant. He was a blacksmith. But he had founded something called the American Political Society. Worcester had elected him as one of the town's representatives in the provincial Congress, and Worcester became one of the Congress's places to gather weapons and supplies. The provincial Congress was defying the law, but it was also acting carefully. Those delegates didn't want to start a war, at least not without being ready for a war. They didn't want to overstep their powers either. An extra legal Congress, well, did they have the authority to collect taxes? No. So they didn't, but they encouraged towns to send the tax revenue that they collected to the provincial Congress's receiver general. They didn't have the authority to make orders for the militia, but they suggested that the towns elect new militia officers and encouraged the towns to form companies that would be ready to march at a short notice. And those became known as the Minutemen. By the start of 1774, General Gage realized that the London government wasn't going to send him much more help. He needed to take action against this growing resistance himself. And he focused on the weapons that people were amassing. Not muskets, but cannon. Cannon had no peacetime use. You didn't go and hunt with a cannon. They were only for war. They usually weren't owned by individuals. They couldn't be operated by an individual. You had to get a whole group together. Some of them, like those brass cannon from Boston, could be traceable as stolen goods and grabbed for that reason. In particular, in fact, Gage wanted the 4 cannon that had stolen from that had vanished from Boston's militia armories. His intelligence files, which are now out at Michigan, show that he tracked information on cannon, especially brass cannon. He collected reports from people in the countryside. He sent scouts out of Boston to gather and verify information. And whenever he had good information, he thought, on cannon, he sent troops out to grab those guns. And that leads me to how, on the evening of March 1st, 1775, Henry Barnes opened the door of his house in Marlborough and found 2 men on his doorstep. Their names were William Brown and Henry de Bernier, and they were spies for General Gage. Brown and de Bernier were British Army officers, but that night they were dressed as civilian surveyors. William Brown was an Englishman born in 1749 and thus about 25 years old. In 1761, as a teenager, he became a lieutenant in the British Army. And at the end of the 7 Years' War, he was pensioned, but in 1766, he returned to active service in the 14th Regiment. Now, that was one of the regiments that was in Boston in the late 1760s into the time of the Boston Massacre in March 1770. So he had already seen the town. In 1771, Brown shifted. He became a captain in the 52nd Regiment. And in 1774, General Gage shifted that regiment to Boston. Henry de Bernier was an ensign in the 10th Regiment of Foot. That name, de Bernier, it is spelled so many different ways, even a wide variety, even by 18th century standards. The de Berniers were a Huguenot family, French Protestants who had come to the British Isles in the 1600s. Henry's father and his older brother John were also army officers. The family, it looks like, didn't have much money, but they did have this profession. They had this professional military tradition. I found conflicting sources about how old Henry de Bernier was in 1774. My best guess is that he was born in the mid to late 1750s, which would put him in his late teens in 1775, and that fits his rank. An ensign was the lowest rank in the British Army, like a second lieutenant. So he was just starting out his military career. The 10th Regiment had been stationed out on the Niagara frontier in territory the British Empire had won from the French Empire during the war. And these are sketches that Ensign de Bernier drew of Niagara Falls and 2 British outposts at either end of the Niagara River, Fort Erie and Fort Niagara. Back on January 8th, General Gage had put in his general orders, which went out to all the troops in Boston. If any officers of the different regiments are capable of taking sketches of a country, they will send their names in to the Deputy Adjutant General. Captain John Barker of the 4th Regiment, who kept a diary and was just always grousing in it, wrote, "That is an extraordinary method of wording an order. It might at least have been in a more genteel way. At present, it looks like he doubted as there were any such capable." But be that as it may, Henry de Bernier, we know, was capable of taking sketches of a country. William Brown was a few years older. He had been in Massachusetts before. Gage paired those 2 officers up to be his scouts. Now, the part of the Provincial Congress dealing with questions of planning of possible military action was the Joint Committee of Safety and Committee on Supplies. The Committee of Safety was reorganizing the militia. The Committee of Supplies was, as you'd expect, collecting supplies for that militia, including cannon. These committees were meeting in towns around Boston, close enough for men in Boston to be able to, and the other coastal towns to be able to attend, just far enough away to be out of General Gage's reach. On February 21st, the committees met in Charlestown. And that was the first meeting of the year attended by a new representative from Boston, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. I'm showing you a picture not of Dr. Church, but of his ancestor, also named Benjamin Church. He was famous for leading New England troops during King Philip's War and against the French settlers in Acadia. So for New Englanders, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. came from this illustrious family. But we don't have a reliable picture of this man, so I'm showing you his ancestor. In the late 1760s and 1770s, Dr. Church was one of the top leaders of the British Patriots, of the Boston Patriots. He had been in strategy discussions for years. He had served on many committees. He delivered the oration in commemoration of the Boston Massacre in 1773. He was especially known for writing satirical verse in the newspapers. In 1774, the town of Boston elected Dr. Church to the Provincial Congress, and he thus became a member of the Committee of Safety. Also on that committee was Dr. Joseph Warren. Back in January 1775, Dr. Warren and Dr. Church had discussed Boston's 4 stolen cannon, those brass cannon that had disappeared from the militia armories. Dr. Warren wrote a letter about how they had been smuggled out of town to Dorchester. Dr. Warren told Samuel Adams that he had told only one other person about this. They would discuss this situation only with Dr. Church. Unfortunately for the Patriots, Dr. Church had become a paid spy for General Gage. Dr. Church was keeping a mistress in what is now Brighton, and he needed money. As I said, on February 21st, Dr. Church attended his first meeting with the Committee of Safety and Committee on Supplies in Charlestown. And that night, General Gage suddenly had a lot more information to write into his intelligence files. And much of that information was about the Provincial Congress's cannon, where those guns were, what blacksmiths were working on mounting them on carriages, who was being paid, who had stopped work because they weren't getting paid. On February 22nd, the very next day after receiving that intelligence, General Gage wrote out orders for Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier. He told those officers to go through the counties of Suffolk and Worcester, taking a sketch of the country as you pass. In particular, Brown and de Bernier were to mark out roads, towns, passes, fords, heights, woods, travel distances, and sites proper for encampments. Gage told the officers that he expected to have occasion to march troops through the country the ensuing spring. The next day, Brown and de Bernier set out on the ferry across the Charles River. And with them, they brought Brown's servant, named John, probably an enlisted man in the British Army. The officers were dressed in civilian clothing, pretending to be surveyors, just ordinary surveyors from Britain out to look for land. The 3 men headed west through Charlestown and Cambridge to Watertown. De Bernier wrote, "A little out of this town, we went into a tavern, a Mr. Brewer's, a Whig we called, for dinner, which was brought to us by a black woman. At first she was very civil, but afterwards began to eye us very attentively. We observed to her that it was a very fine country, upon which she answered, 'So it is, and we have got brave fellows to defend it. And if you go up any higher, you will find it so.' This disconcerted us a great deal. After we had left the house, we inquired of John, our servant, what she had said. And he told us she knew Captain Brown very well, and knew him to be an officer, and that she was sure I was one also, and told John that he was a regular. He denied it, but she said she knew our errand was to take a plan of the country." So at that point, these 2 spies knew that their cover was blown. Their mission was known. It didn't look like that woman had told anyone else, but nobody was trying to arrest them, so maybe they could keep going. And in fact, they said they felt they had a great number of enemies in town because the general had chose to employ us in preference to them, and that if we went back, we should appear very foolish. Their enemies were other British officers who did not get this assignment. And that was what motivated them to feel that it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester. Brown and de Bernier hiked on to the town of Weston, and they arrived at Isaac Jones's tavern at the site of the sign of the Golden Ball. Originally, they simply wanted to get a drink and to so proceed, but they liked Jones for 2 reasons. One, he was not so inquisitive. And second, when they ordered coffee, he told us we might have what we pleased, either tea or coffee. Offering tea was a giveaway of the innkeeper's political leaning. We immediately found out with whom we were, and were not a little pleased to find on conversation that he was a friend of government. That was a term for a loyalist. And in fact, in 1774, Jones had gotten into a dispute with his neighbors in Weston over selling tea. And then he had seen the Patriot faction in town take over the town government, kick his cousin Elisha out of office, and then out of town. The officers talked with Isaac Jones about other places that would be safe for them. Now, I've been showing you details from a map that was an artifact of this mission. This is a map that's in the collection of the Library of Congress. And a few years back, a staffer there named Ed Redmond realized that it shows many of the places mentioned in de Bernier's report and lists sort of Loyalist safe houses. And he concluded, and I'm convinced he's right, that Ensign de Bernier drew this map. On this map, west is at the top, so the Boston Neck is at the bottom. It's a little confusing. De Bernier sketched out the locations of town centers, the roads in between. He noted several Loyalist houses along the way. So we actually have very good documentation from de Bernier of this whole mission. The next day, Brown and de Bernier walked further west, reaching Worcester, which was their goal. Meanwhile, back in Boston, General Gage had received word of cannon hidden in Salem. This may well have come from Dr. Church. He dispatched 240 soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie to raid the hiding place on Sunday, February 26th. The Provincial Congress, in fact, did have an agent in Salem who was collecting cannon and mounting them on carriages, but that man and his neighbors were able to block Lieutenant Colonel Leslie at a drawbridge and hide all the cannon and keep them out of British hands. So while that was going on in Salem, Brown and de Bernier were stuck in Worcester because it was Sunday. And at that time, the law said that you weren't allowed to travel between one town and another on Sunday unless it was an emergency. That was the law in New England for many decades. So they stayed at their inn in Worcester and they worked on their sketches and notes. But the fact that the British Army was once again going out into the countryside, doing weapons searches, that changed the environment. And at the end of the day, someone came to the tavern in Worcester, maybe friendly, maybe not, and told Brown and de Bernier that they had been recognized as British Army officers. So the next morning, they headed back east. Brown and de Bernier came back through Framingham where they saw militia training, and on Tuesday, they were back at Isaac Jones's Tavern in Weston, which was basically at this point a spy safe house. De Bernier wrote, "We slept at Jones's that night and got all our sketches together and sent them to Boston with our man." A snowstorm blew up, keeping the officers in this tavern until 2 p.m. Then they felt it safe enough to go on with their mission to head to Marlborough, to go to Mr. Barnes's, a gentleman to whom we were recommended and a friend to government. It was snowing again as Brown and de Bernier approached Marlborough. A horseman overtook them and asked them where they were coming from. They said, "Weston." He asked if they lived in Weston. They said no. He asked them where they did live. As we found, there was no evading his questions, de Bernier wrote. "We told them we lived at Boston and we were headed to Marlborough to see a friend." Eventually, this writer came out and asked the men if they were in the army. Brown de Bernier denied that, but now they were a good deal alarmed. After some rather impertinent questions, the local rode on ahead to town. Evidently, that writer told his neighbors about meeting these two suspicious men, because as Brown and de Bernier hiked through a village, the people came out of their houses, though it snowed and blew very hard, to look at us. A baker asked Brown where they were going. Brown dropped Barnes's name. This doesn't seem like very good spycraft, but by that point, the captain had probably figured out that everybody would be watching where they went anyway. And in fact, Timothy Bigelow of Worcester had warned his colleagues in Marlborough a couple of days before that spies might be on their way to their town. Some men had even gathered in the tavern in Marlborough to make plans. That day, the officers had gone to Weston instead, but now those men were on Henry Barnes's doorstep. Barnes welcomed these two young strangers from England inside. They apologized for taking the liberty to make use of his house and revealed that they were British Army officers in disguise. Barnes told the men that his neighbors were on the alert. Marlborough was very violent, he said, and they could be safe nowhere but in this home. Barnes asked if the two men had spoken to anyone on their way into town, and they mentioned the baker. A little startled, Barnes explained that the baker was a very mischievous fellow, and there was a deserter from the army living at his house. And indeed, That was drummer John Swain from Brown's own company in the 52nd Regiment. So he certainly knew what his captain looked like and was probably confirming to all the neighbors that these men were military spies. And then came another knock at the door. Barnes told the officers to stay in a quiet, an interior room. He went to the door and found Dr. Samuel Curtis, a young physician. Now, for several years, the leading doctor in Marlborough had been Dr. Ebenezer Dexter, but he had died in 1769. Samuel Curtis moved into that town in June of that year, just a couple of years after graduating from Harvard College. Dr. Curtis had a couple of advantages in setting up a practice. He was the son of a minister, so he is from the genteel class. Also, Dr. Dexter's widow invited him to rent a room in her house. So if you were going to Dr. Dexter, it was very easy for you just to go to Dr. Curtis. The widow, Lydia Dexter, was still only in her early 30s with 4 young sons to care for and an estate to maintain, so she probably wanted the boarder. And then in early 1771, she became pregnant. And on June 30th, the widow Dexter married the young Dr. Curtis, 10 years her junior, and baby Anna arrived a little more than 3 months later. You don't need medical training to figure out what happened. So people in Marlborough must have gossiped about this, but that gossip didn't stop the town from putting Dr. Curtis on the town committee of correspondence in 1772. This was the committee organizing resistance to the royal government's taxes. Unfortunately, the Curtis marriage didn't last, not because of incompatibility, but because of illnesses. In March 1774, Lydia Curtis gave birth to her second child by Samuel, a daughter named Christian, but within 1 week in December of 1774, the Curtises' first daughter, Anna, their new baby, Christian, and Lydia all died. Over the next year, Dr. Curtis, now a widower, remained politically active. In addition to the Committee of Correspondence, he was Marlborough's representative to the Middlesex County Convention in August 1774. And thus, on March 1st, 1775, Curtis was pushing himself into Henry Barnes's house, asking if he could stay for supper. This struck Barnes as suspicious. He hadn't invited the doctor for supper. In fact, Dr. Curtis hadn't visited the Barnes house for 2 years. And of course, the doctor was on the Committee of Correspondence. In a way, Curtis was also on a spying mission, seeking information for the Patriots about these strangers. Henry Barnes told Curtis that he could not have the pleasure of attending him that night because he already had company. Dr. Curtis then turned to little Chrissy Arbuthnot, that Barnes's 10-year-old niece. He asked her who her father had got with him. And de Bernier later wrote, the child innocently answered that she had asked her papa, but he told her it was not her business. Chrissy here is represented by an unnamed French girl from the 1770s. So Dr. Curtis, he is suspicious. He had done his best to wheedle information out from Chrissy, but he was stymied and he left. But all the men in the house assumed that he was just going to fetch his political allies. Brown and de Bernier promised Henry Barnes that they would leave at midnight. After they just want a couple hours rest, then they would leave regardless of whether the snow had stopped. And they were just beginning to eat supper when Barnes came back with news from his household servants, perhaps from Daphne. The locals intended to attack these strangers, he said. Only 20 minutes or so after they arrived, Brown and de Bernier were on the move again. Barnes took them out of his house by the stables and directed us a by-road which would avoid the center of Marlborough. The young officers tramped on through the blowing snow. At Sudbury, they went into a little wood where we ate a bit of bread that we took from Mr. Barnes's and ate a little snow to wash it down. At the next house, a man came out and asked Brown, "What do you think will become of you now?" Further on, 3 or 4 horsemen watched silently from either side of the road as the strangers passed between them. Finally, that night, the 2 men got back to their safe house, the Golden Ball Tavern in Weston. De Bernier wrote they had walked 32 miles between 2 o'clock and 10:30 at night, through a road that every step we sunk up to our ankles, and it blowing and drifting snow all the way. Meanwhile, there was another knock at Henry Barnes's door. The whole Marlborough Committee of Correspondence demanded to see the visitors. Among these men coming were Alpheus Woods, who 5 years earlier had been on the town committee to inspect Barnes's customers. Barnes insisted that the two visitors had not been army officers, but relations of his wife from Penobscot in Maine. You wouldn't know them. They're from Penobscot. And anyway, they were now gone to Lancaster, to the west. They were all gone to the west. According to de Bernier, the committee searched his house from top to bottom, looked under the beds and in their cellars, and found when they found we were gone, they told them if they had caught us at the house, they would have pulled it down about his ears. Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier made it back into Boston from Weston. De Bernier wrote out a detailed report, which is our main source for this episode. And a few days later, Henry Barnes left Marlborough and moved into Boston as well. Christian Barnes moved out of her house to stay with a wealthy friend, and they left their estate in the hands of Henry's adult niece. And they never saw that estate again. In that same month of March 1775, General Gage started to receive reports from a spy in Concord. He or she reported on weapons in the countryside, including a big cache in Worcester. He or she also located the 4 brass cannons stolen from Boston in Concord. Plus, that town held a lot of iron cannon and gunpowder. And this spy even reported which individuals in town were holding that material. Most of the weapons were on the farm of James Barrett, a militia colonel and delegate to the Provincial Congress. Gage wanted to confirm what that spy reported from Concord. So he turned to Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier. Sure, they had been recognized once, but they were going to a different town. On March 20th, Brown and de Bernier headed back out to Weston and then on to Concord. That trip wasn't as eventful as the first one, or at least de Bernier didn't record as much about it. They reached Concord. They confirmed that the Patriots had those 4 brass cannon concealed in some place behind the town in a wood. They also connected with another loyalist, the lawyer Daniel Bliss. Once he had those men in his house, he no longer felt safe in Concord. So he came with Brown and de Bernier, and they headed back to Boston by a different route from the way they came out. They headed back through the town of Lexington. That spring, the Provincial Congress began to deploy its artillery forces, all the cannon it had collected. The Committee of Safety concentrated most of its guns in Concord and Worcester. General Gage knew from Dr. Church all about that. He knew from the spy in Concord where the guns were. From Brown and de Bernier, Gage had a confirmation of a cannon in Concord, and he knew how far Worcester was. All in all, he looked around and he said, Concord looks like a better deal. On April 14th, Gage received orders from London to take action against the rebellion, even if such a proceeding should be, according to your own idea of it, a signal for hostilities. I do something even if it causes a war. So he drew up his orders for the march on Concord. The head of de Bernier's 10th Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, commanded that mission. Ensign de Bernier went along, probably on horseback as a scout, because after all, he had been to Concord before. Captain Brown marched as the captain of the Light Infantry Company of the 52nd Regiment. Daniel Bliss was going back to Concord as a civilian scout. That column left Boston late at night on April 18th, 1775. And on the way to Concord, that expedition had to pass by the Lexington Town Common. Part of that town's militia company were drawn up on the common with their muskets. The Light Infantry Company of the 10th Regiment confronted those men. There was shooting, men died, the first military deaths of this conflict. The British expedition continued on to Concord, taking over that town. 4 companies went further west across the North Bridge to search Barrett's farm, and one of those companies was the 52nd Light Infantry under Captain William Brown. So he and his men actually reached the location where Boston's brass cannon had been hidden until the night before. All that those companies found at Barrett's farm were some wheels suitable for cannon carriages, which they burned, and then they headed back east. And then as they crossed over the town's North Bridge, they found the bodies of 2 redcoats. One had not only been shot in a skirmish with the locals, but had been hatcheted in the head. So now both sides, the Crown and the Provincials, had seen men killed. Both sides believed that the other side had started the violence and had committed atrocities. And that was when the war was really on. By the end of the day, there were thousands of provincial militiamen besieging the British Army in Boston. That was the start of the Revolutionary War. we have glimpses of Henry Barnes and the spies in his house through the war. Captain William Brown's 52nd Regiment fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here's a map of the battle published in the Analectic magazine in 1818. And on this map, south is up and north is down. So it's not just you. Here we see the 52nd Regiment lined up on the North Charlestown shore. They advanced uphill against the east side of the provincial redoubt. By the end of the day, they were camped on the west side of the hill, close to the narrow neck that led to the rest of Charlestown and Cambridge. In other words, they were on the front lines of the fight, and Captain Brown had been wounded in the leg. Furthermore, this map was engraved from a sketch by Henry de Bernier. Now, in February 1776, Henry and Christian Barnes sailed for England. He had received word that he had a bequest waiting for him in England. So he had more money in England than he had in America. And with them, they took their little niece, Chrissy, and eventually their other niece, the one who had stayed to try to hold on to the estate in Marlborough, she gave up and joined them in Britain, and the family never returned to America. The British military left Boston the month after the Barneses in March 1776, but the 10th and 52nd Regiments were part of the British Army that came back to America after the Declaration of Independence, capturing New York in the fall of 1776. By then, Captain Brown had been promoted to major. Those regiments fought in more campaigns, including the capture of Philadelphia in 1777. Major Brown moved to the 49th Regiment, and in late 1778, that unit helped to seize St. Lucia from the French. And in 1780, the 49th was sent to Ireland. Just before the formal end of the war, Major Brown was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and a member of the Irish Parliament called him one of the best officers in the army. And that's as far as I can trace William Brown, because it's very hard to trace men with such common names. Meanwhile, Henry de Bernier's 10th Regiment fought in the battles of Monmouth and Rhode Island. He became a lieutenant in the war and then a captain lieutenant sometime in 1783, and the Napoleonic Wars opened up more opportunities for officers. In November 1796, de Bernier was lieutenant colonel in charge of the 9th Regiment. However, those wars also brought dangers. The regiment was deployed on the continent, but he was in a transport ship heading, I think, to Spain when the ship was wrecked on the coast of France. And he spent the next 7 years as a prisoner of war in France with his wife and children with him. And then Napoleon was defeated, but Henry de Bernier died of a fever in camp in Nancy, France in December 1813. That was 38 years after he had come through Marlborough as a young ensign and a spy. Thank you. Okay, we'll have questions. Deirdre has some microphones for you to make sure that your voices are picked up on the live feed. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and they will bring a microphone to you.
Hello. Yeah, I used to live in Concord prior to moving back here. So I'm familiar with the cannon issue there. How many cannon in total did the Patriot cause have at that point that they were the war started?
Very good question. How many cannon? In March 1775 or early April 1775, the Committee of Safety assigned 38 cannon to different towns. And it's usually thought that the provincials had hardly any cannon. In fact, they had dozens of cannon. They had a very large cannon that was put onto the fort at Roxbury, which was larger than any of those that Henry Knox brought back from Fort Ticonderoga and Lake Champlain. So it is a myth that we Americans like to tell each other that we're the underdogs, that we're the scrappy underdogs. But in fact, just a week before all this happened, James Warren, the husband of Mercy Warren and a political leader, wrote from Concord to his wife, "This town is full of cannon." Concord, in addition to the 4 brass cannon that were out at Barrett's Farm, they had 4 in the courthouse that belonged to the town itself, and then they had 10 iron guns, which also belonged to the Provincial Congress and were moved out just shortly before the march. So it really was full of cannon. Any other questions? Way in the back. In fact, I wrote a book called The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, which has more than you could possibly want to know about cannon that the Massachusetts provincials had before the war.
I don't know if it's even possible to know this, but with the revolutionaries also having their own spies, wasn't there someone who worked their way into Gage's as a revolutionary spy that was reporting back to?
There are certainly the Boston Patriots under Dr. Joseph Warren had their own spies. And just earlier this year, I published an article naming one of those men, a man named William Jasper. Unfortunately, it's not as romantic as the story that has been told as a possibility for a number of years now, which is that General Gage's own wife was an informant for Dr. Warren. I don't think there's any strong evidence for that. It is said that General Gage and his wife were estranged. Well, they were estranged enough to have more children together in Britain. Furthermore, there is this story told very early on that Colonel Percy, the second in command, after hearing his orders from General Gage, went out to the Boston Common and heard locals discussing the whole mission, and came back, and Gage supposedly said, "I've only told one other person about this." And in the 20th century, people began to wonder, was the one other person his wife? Which would mean that one other person would not have been his military secretary, who's some sort of person you definitely need to tell. Furthermore, the military secretary was, he was the wife's brother. He was also born in America. He actually returned to America after the war. Everything that seemed to be incriminating about her also applied to him. So if anyone said, she was a New Jersey native. She was an American native. I think one of the problems with the idea that the Patriots had really good intelligence about what the British were up to is that when Warren sent out Paul Revere and William Dawes to warn Hancock and Adams in Lexington that soldiers were on their way and they had better take care, that wasn't what the soldiers were looking for. If they had stayed in Lexington in the parsonage, Hancock with his sword all ready to be arrested and make a big deal, the whole column of the troops, of the British troops, would have just marched on half a mile from the place and not stopped. It's only in hindsight that Americans believe that they were the problem of the campaign. But if you look at Gage's orders, he was not tracking Hancock and Adams. He did not mention them in his orders. There was no foray of soldiers to go find them. So the Americans had good information about the march, but they didn't know where it was headed. And fortunately, they were already paranoid about their weapons in Concord and were already moving them away, so that there was very little to be found when Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his men reached Concord.
Oh, yeah. The show Turn was pretty popular, right, on spying, and it was very enjoyable. I was wondering if you had a perspective on what we know about the spy network in the during the American Revolution on the revolutionary side. Are there any gaps in that? Are we still looking for some key people that were spies that we don't know or know more about?
Looking for American spies, are there still gaps? And I'm one of the people who's doing my best to fill those gaps. So in addition to William Jasper, another person there is in July 1775, very shortly after arriving in Cambridge, General Washington sent a man into Boston to send out intelligence. And I think I've identified that man because his Washington's military secretary sent a letter to an American officer saying, you will be receiving this message. You are going to pass it on to this guy, who will pass it on to this guy, who will pass it on to this person with these initials inside Boston, and those initials we can say. Well, that was very bad spycraft, because all the military secretary needed to tell this officer is, you're going to get this letter, you're going to pass it on to this guy, don't ask any questions. But furthermore, the secretary did write in this letter, destroy this letter, which the officer did not do. So that's another very bad spycraft. But in September of 1775, through a change of circumstances, Washington learned that Dr. Benjamin Church had been spying, had been sending information into besieged Boston. And although they weren't able to, they didn't have all the goods on him, that seems to have been the moment when Washington and his staff suddenly looked around and said, our Surgeon General, the highest ranking medical officer in the Army, man who lives, living half a block from headquarters, who has been in the top Patriot leadership for a decade, is a spy. Then they became very, very much more secure. And that's when the gaps start to appear. As for Turn Washington Spies, I enjoyed it. It was entertaining. It took a lot of liberties. One of the key elements of that story is the story of Anna Strong, who is basically the female lead. And her involvement in this spy ring is based entirely on a tradition involving hanging laundry that was passed down in a family, supposedly, and first published in the 1930s. And I don't understand how these signals were supposed to have worked. I don't trust them, but you need a female lead in a TV show. So I did enjoy that show. I reviewed it for a website, but I think that it is an exaggerated portrait of what actually happened, which is dramatic enough in itself. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. Hold on, there's a mic coming through. There we go.
How typical was it with the Barnes fleeing, essentially? By the start of the war, had most Loyalists left Eastern Massachusetts, would you say?
The most prominent Loyalists, the men who were appointed to the council, they either resigned and tried to get back in good with their neighbors, or they left and they went into Boston. And that took place over the months from August 1775 to the start of the war. Those were the men who had big mansions. You were appointed to the council if you were rich already. So a lot of the houses that existed after the war belonged to these very prominent Loyalists who felt the knell calling for them and got out of town. Then there were people who could claim that they were not political, like Christian Barnes. She was still out in the countryside when the war began. She was staying with a woman named Elizabeth Inman, who remained in the countryside through the siege, trying to hold on to her various properties. She was immensely rich, and trying to use her position as a woman to say, no, I'm not involved in politics. And the people around her were saying, well, you're from Scotland, so you're not local. Your brother was a justice of the peace, very loyal to the king. Your husband seems to be loyalist. You rented some of your properties to the British Army back in 1768. She was seen as a Tory lady, and she really struggled to maintain herself as apolitical. And she succeeded, because you can do that when you're very rich. But she is the rare case where she actually held on to her property and stayed in the countryside. Many more of the most prominent families moved into Boston. There are also, of course, sort of working class loyalists, ordinary farmers who just felt more loyalty to the king. And those we just don't have as much documentation for.
I think we have time for one more question.
I would like to ask about the portraits that we have of Kristen and Henry. Would you comment about the damage to them? And also, is there any truth to the fact that Prince Demah may have copied a Copley to make
I-
Kristen's portrait?
This is, I don't think of myself as an expert on this, and this is in fact the first time I've seen the portraits in the flesh. Obviously, there is a tear on Christian's breast, which indicates some damage at some point. Yes, I have read the possibility that he was copying a Copley. Certainly, the Barneses were aware of Copley. The fact that Christian refers to Copley by calls him Mr. Copling makes me think that she had not actually spent hours sitting for him and had not dealt with him directly, had only heard about him. Mr. Copling, or Mr. Copley, did paint her friend Elizabeth Inman, did paint other people in the circle. So she would certainly have heard about him, but I'm actually wondering whether these are Prince Demah's own portraits. Again, I'm not an expert in this, so whatever it was, he didn't get to paint many portraits that survived, it looks like. So he may still have been developing his technique during this time, and therefore it's with such a small database, it's hard to figure out the stylistic aspects of it. So I'm interested in that question myself, but I do not have an answer. All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you, JL. That was fantastic. And thank you all so much for joining us for this afternoon for the Spies in Henry Barnes's house. We hope you will come back and join us December 8th for the next lecture in our series, which is going to feature Dr. Robert Allison. He is a professor of history, language, and global culture at Suffolk University, and he will present on From Hingham to Yorktown, the military campaigns of our very own General Benjamin Lincoln. And I also want to say a very special thank you to Colin McGinnis for his technical assistance. And to our fantastic volunteers who made you all feel so welcome and have been very diligent in setting up our reception downstairs in the ballroom, where if you have more questions for JL, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them. I would be remiss if I didn't let you go without saying that your support of the Hingham Historical Society is so essential to what we do. It powers our mission to collect, preserve, and promote Hingham's historic heritage. And we're nearing the end of the year, and we hope you will consider a gift to the Hingham History Fund this year. By giving to our fund, you're providing immersive field trips for dozens of local students. You're preserving our historic properties and collections, and you're enabling us to innovate with our community partners and with cutting-edge technology. So by giving to the fund, you are taking an active role in securing Hingham's history for the future. And please come and find Deirdre if you have questions, or you can also visit our website, hinghamhistorical.org, for more information. So please join me in thanking Mr. J.L. Bell again for his fantastic lecture. And at this time, the Zoom presentation will end, and we invite all of you who are here with us in person to join us on the second floor for a reception. Thank you so much.